Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, but know many of you are joining us from other lands near and far. As a school that cares deeply about questions of justice and equity, we at RegNet stand in solidarity with the First Nations activists and communities who have been working to bring attention to struggles still faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. We at RegNet are a hub where we collaborate between disciplines to understand how governance and regulation are shaped by connections and disconnections. COVID-19 has redefined the meaning of connection and disconnection. The global pandemic has disconnected us in ways we could not imagine, but despite that, we keep finding new ways to connect. Conversations 2021 will host a series of panels aiming to illuminate how connections and disconnections shape outcomes across domains including justice, welfare, and trade. Conversations as a series emerged to capture discussions happening in the RegNet building and to spark new discussions across RegNet and beyond. However, not all voices in RegNet are represented here. We're over 20 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, and not everyone has experienced the disruption of this pandemic in the same way. The uneven distribution of the load of the pandemic is one of many factors shaping the voices that are captured in this discussion, and is one of the many areas where we need to continue to have conversations now and in the future. Today will be part of an exciting conversation about regulatory welfare. On the panel are Jenna Harb, Professor Kate Hanna, Walter Johnson, Professor Veronica Taylor, and Dr. Anthea Vogel. They'll be speaking about domains of the regulatory state, often understood as disconnected: welfare, development, and migration. The panel will shed light on how current understandings of the regulatory welfare state would benefit from building stronger connections with other interdisciplinary fields. The panel is facilitated by Professor Kate Hanna, the director of RegNet and leader of the ANU Justice and Technoscience Lab. She's also an honorary professor in the College of Health Solutions at Arizona State University. Her research interests are concerned with how science and technology contribute to the governance of persons and populations, and with the aim of supporting more equitable regulatory approaches. Her current work examines the rise of the digital welfare state and its implications for the regulation of social assistance delivery. Also on the panel, we'll hear from Dr. Anthea Vogel, Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of Technology in Sydney. Her research takes a critical interdisciplinary approach to the regulation of migrants and non-citizens, with a particular focus on the social and legal categories of the refugee and irregular migrant. For the last 4 years, she has studied refugee narratives and oral hearings within onshore refugee status determination processes in Australia and Canada. Jenna Harb is a doctoral candidate at RegNet, the School of Regulation and Global Governance. Jenna's PhD thesis examines how social welfare systems in Lebanon have responded and adapted to sustained crises in the country, such as economic collapse, divisive politics, COVID-19, and the aftermath of the explosion in Beirut. Her research brings together insights from regulatory studies, science and technology studies, and critical humanitarian studies. Walter Johnson is a PhD student at RegNet whose ongoing work investigates how regulatory systems are shaping and being shaped by emerging neurotechnologies. More generally, his research examines the ethical, social, and legal dimensions of a variety of current and emerging technologies. His publications span a wide range of topics, from heritable human genome editing to quantum computing. Last but not least, Professor Veronica Taylor is a professor of law and regulation at RegNet who has worked extensively on a range of regulatory issues in Asia. Her work centers on regulatory intermediation and institutional reform. Her work has spanned issues of international law and justice norm-making, comparative studies of contracts, competition, and corporate governance. She has more than 30 years professional experience as a designer and implementer of legal reform for aid programs in 15 countries. I'm very excited to hear from this panel, and I hope you'll join me all in that excitement. Before I hand over to Kate, just a couple of housekeeping items, which I believe have also been put into the chat. So the webinar will be recorded, and your name and voice will be recorded and audible to others listening to the webinar if you verbally ask a question from the audience. The video and audio of our speakers, including their shared screens, will be recorded. Throughout the presentation, if you're in the audience, your video is turned off and you're muted, so we will only be able to hear the speakers and conveners. If you would like to ask a question, you can do so by submitting your questions in written form via the chat function, or you can use the raise your hand function at the end of the presentation. If you raise your hand, then we can take you off mute and you'll be able to ask your question. If you're on social media, you can tweet live using the @ANURegnet handle. And now I will hand over to Kate, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Lee, for that wonderful introduction. To begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we're meeting today. I'm joining everyone from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I appreciate that many of you are joining us from lands other than here, both near and far. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians for their continuing connection to and their stewardship of these lands. I pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all First Nations colleagues who are on the call today. That said, I'm delighted to be chairing the second session of our annual conversation series here at RegNet. As Lee mentioned, the focus of our panel today is going to be on the regulatory state and its reach across domains of governance, using welfare as a lens to bring those diverse concerns in dialogue with each other. So for more than 2 decades, the topic of the regulatory state has generated important analyses of how states have adapted their approaches to governing populations. What we're going to do today is take up some critical questions about how to make sense of some of those changes within the regulatory state, particularly since the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, through to now as we're facing twin crises of COVID-19 and climate change. Thus, I'm going to use my introductory remarks to offer a short reflection on that scholarship and its connections to the panelists' interventions today. So earlier formations of the regulatory state are well known for capturing shifts in government policy and how they, upon further reflection, revealed deeper transformations of state and market connections. RegNet's founder, John Braithwaite, has characterized these movements as going from being governed by Keynesian techniques to those that reflect an embrace of market competition, privatized institutions, and decentered state regulation. So in doing so, John and others like David Levy-Ford draw important connections that have challenged popular understandings of the relationship between neoliberalism and regulation. That is, neoliberalism didn't necessarily mean full-on deregulation, even of social services or welfare provision. Rather, these shifts are important opportunities for examining the interconnected nature of social policy, regulatory change, and the processes actually underpinning them. So in many ways, that earlier work was concerned with tracing how the welfare state had become a regulatory state. In fact, some of those depictions have rendered this as a development from an older welfare state model to a new regulatory state model. But more recently, experts have really actively troubled that dichotomy. So contributors to a 2020 special issue on the rise of the regulatory welfare state have taken a strong stance that the welfare state has always been regulatory, that regulation for explicitly social purposes, which we'll be discussing today, has actually been increasing for some time. So in short, the regulatory state has not replaced the welfare state. Rather, the regulatory welfare state has continued to change over time. And as Levy-Ford clearly states, what has changed is how laws, policies, administration, and regulatory techniques have been employed to distribute welfare to different individuals and groups. In fact, he emphasizes that we're currently in a period in which regulation is significantly expanding through modes of liberalization, privatization, and the new public management of social services. In other words, these developments are thoroughly entangled. And I just want to take a brief minute to just acknowledge that there's some really fantastic pieces in that recent special issue, and they really illustrate these points in myriad ways, including works by other RegNet colleagues, John Braithwaite, who I've mentioned, but also Sora Lee and Valerie Braithwaite. And as such, this renewed focus on the regulatory welfare state has made some very important connections, such as how the visibility of regulatory instruments prompts us to rethink more traditional conceptions of the welfare state. They provide robust analyses of how regulation, accompanying fiscal transfers for social purposes, is growing, but also extending beyond our more narrow definitions of welfare, which the panelists will certainly explore today. And increasingly, they're also tracing these trends globally, not just within countries characterized as being part of the global north. Again, something we'll highlight more today. And as such, they show us how markets have come to shape public services and infrastructure, doing so in ways that reveal how regulation and capitalism are intimately connected. And moreover, they illustrate how welfare dynamics are being reframed in this process. So for example, documented patterns in the research evince how welfare recipients and service providers are increasingly being understood as consumers. Pursuing compliance through various modes of enforcement has become a central preoccupation in these regulatory welfare states. And competition between prospective providers, both public and private, has been normalized, often presented as a means of ensuring efficiency and quality of service provision. So overall, we see that this emergent research really helps to illuminate and unpack developments in the regulatory welfare state, accounting for their normative, institutional, and individual dimensions. That said, while this growing literature makes important connections, it still leaves us, at least those of us on the panel today, with some lingering questions. So for instance, while there's a strong recognition of capitalistic influences about the state and its transformation, how do other dimensions of these systems, as well as social categories of difference, inform these changes? So just to give a concrete example, scholars in other fields have detailed how policies have given rise to earlier models of the welfare state and how they were explicitly gendered projects that either targeted poor women or sought to preserve heterosexual family units. So in short, these concerns were inextricably linked to questions of welfare, regulation, and tacit beliefs about labor and productivity, also thoroughly gendered. We also know that colonialism has profoundly shaped many nation states and their governance, influencing not only their approaches to social welfare and regulation, but also their relationships to capitalism. So how do such factors coalesce and shape the regulatory welfare state in its current form? What about its possible futures as we grapple with the effects of COVID-19, as well as looking at challenges of climate crisis? Further, there are ongoing developments that prompt us to reflect on other disconnections being addressed in closely related fields of inquiry. For example, is the growth of e-government initiatives and the reliance on digital infrastructure actually changing the nature of the regulatory welfare state? We'll get some more insights from panelists today. But early indicators would suggest that the digitization of regulatory welfare is introducing new infrastructure that might actually be changing the nature of regulatory welfare and government services. Obviously, we can't answer all those questions today, but our aim is to generate a conversation that draws on examples that are arguably right now at the fringes of this broader discussion about the regulatory welfare state. And we hope to use those insights to usefully advance this important body of work. Thus, while we're acknowledging the conceptual and empirical connections coming out of existing regulatory governance scholarship, we also want to interrogate points of disconnection. And thus, our panelists today are going to offer provocations informed by their own work, using their contributions to illuminate concerns that relate to welfare, and to hopefully spark some ideas that can be connected back to pressing questions about the regulatory state, as well as the crises that we're facing today. So with that, you probably want to hear from others and not me, and I should shift to logistics. So first, Anna Fieldhouse, who's on the program, is unfortunately not available to be with us today. But I do want to make just a brief note about how Anna's just an absolute rising star in this area. She's one of our Sir Roland Wilson scholars here at RegNet, and so she's bringing deep knowledge as a public servant and also cutting edge insights into her research. And while she cannot be with us today, we are here today having this conversation in large part because of Anna's enthusiasm for this topic and her ongoing collaboration with another one of our speakers today, PhD scholar Gemma Hart. So many thanks to you both for encouraging us to have and share this conversation. In terms of order of the panel, we're going to introduce Dr. Anthea Vogel to kick us off. Jenna will go next, then Walter Johnson, and then Veronica Taylor. In terms of format, I will let each panelist speak and then invite questions from the audience. And if time permits, we'll also invite panelists to comment on each other's work before we conclude the session. But overall, we're really looking forward to a vibrant set of really diverse contributions and hearing everyone's thoughts from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. I think everyone should be able to see my screen before I get going. Excellent. It's an absolute pleasure to be joining the panel today and the excellent series celebrating RegNet that this conversation is part of. Before I begin, I wanted to warmly thank Jenna Harb, Anna Fieldhouse and RegNet for the invitation to be here and all of the work in bringing us together. Before I begin my paper, I also want to acknowledge that I live, work and learn on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and that sovereignty over this land was never ceded, and that the struggle for it goes on. So my paper today is entitled Outsourcing Deterrence, the Humanitarian Border, Asylum Seekers and Non-Government Organisations in Australia. It was great to hear Kate's introduction and to realise how many themes the paper picks up on and how many intersections there'll be in the panelist conversation today. My paper examines the Australian government's direct outsourcing of border control to NGOs. And in particular, what I want to do today is map and discuss the outsourcing to NGOs of both the provision of welfare services and the policing and surveillance of asylum seekers who arrived in Australia by boat. While I think many of you tuning in today probably have a fairly good sense of core aspects of Australia's refugee policy, it bears quickly explaining that Australia has a policy of mandatory immigration detention of anyone in the community without a valid visa. That's a policy that applies to asylum seekers who arrived irregularly, that is without a valid visa, and specifically and kind of very much in the public imaginary, those who arrived by boat. Up until about 2012, all boat arrivals were indeed detained either within Australia or in so-called offshore detention centres, or rather prison camps. However, since the early 2010s, roughly, there has been an ever widening and very significant gap between the law of mandatory indefinite detention and the reality of regulating onshore asylum seekers, whereby most asylum seekers who arrived in Australia by boat are now living in the community on what are called bridging visas, so temporary visas, while their claims are being assessed. To provide a sense of numbers before I get going, and a sense of that distinction, as of March this year, about 12,000 asylum seekers were living in the community. At the same time, approximately 290 people who were sought asylum by boat were actually still in onshore immigration detention. This slide gives a rough sense of how the rest of my talk will proceed. It's essentially in two parts. In the first part, I will quite briefly outline a growing body of work on humanitarian borders, which used to frame my analysis and my research in this area. I then present the matrix of law, contract and policy, which facilitates humanitarian intervention at Australia's internal borders by examining two aspects of the contracted NGOs' work. First is their role in enforcing asylum seekers' quite unique asylum seeker code of behaviour, which I'll explain in a moment. Second, I will look at the NGO's role as the primary administrators of the government's deterrence-orientated asylum seeker welfare program, which I'll refer to as the SRSS, which stands for the Status Resolution Support Service. Before moving on, it's important to underline the particular nature of the NGOs that are responsible for the SRSS and welfare in the asylum seeker space. The status of these organisations is neither as independent advocacy organisations or as volunteer-based charity organisations. They have direct contracts with government, one via open competitive tender to deliver the SRSS. This point is central to my analysis, and it ultimately informs the argument that I'm trying to make and the intervention into some of the work on humanitarian borders and humanitarianism at the border. Namely, that I think the role of the contracted NGOs in this space moves beyond a tension between care and control that has been identified in work on humanitarian borders. Instead, I think the NGOs are captured by the government as direct partners in immigration control and deterrence, even as they are informed by their own mandates of care, welfare and asylum seeker support. This capture not only has a classic net widening effect on the actors involved in migration control and on sites of discretionary power and decision making, it diminishes the NGO's capacity to contest and resist state policy, and especially with the asylum seeker code of behaviour, directly involves them in the administration of internal borders and exclusions. So now to pretty briefly turn to a very vastly growing and fast growing literature on humanitarian governance at the border. that border policing and humanitarianism are simply not separate domains of action, informed Walter's identification of the border itself as a site of humanitarian governance roughly a decade ago now. Core to Walter's and indeed Polster, Wilkins and Tickton's work, all of which I rely on in this research, is the claim that state actors and humanitarian organisations with stated missions of providing care and preserving life simultaneously produce forms of migration control that cause and legitimise restrictive immigration policies. Successive Australian governments are, of course, on board with using humanitarian forms of governance to justify policies preventing asylum seekers access to territory and access to their rights. Most notably, this is with our violent and lethal detention policies and maritime deterrence policies, which have been repeatedly cast as saving lives at sea, rather than as a tool of immigration enforcement or control. These mergers of humanitarian care and securitisation imperatives take place on the high seas, at the territorial border and beyond it. My work, though, examines how humanitarian organisations are incorporated into the enforcement of interior border controls. That is, those border controls which really infiltrate the fabric of everyday life, following work by Leanne Webber, and an internal border regime that really operates alongside externalised border controls for asylum seekers seeking to access refugee protection. What follows is a system or structural analysis of the NGOs involved in migration control. In undertaking this preliminary research, what became evident is that there is an urgent need for some on-the-ground research into NGOs' participation in the distribution of welfare and the surveillance of asylum seekers. And their work which is really occurring in a complex way at the intersection of administrative, criminal, contract law and regulation. So in terms of the organisations that I am talking about and who are involved in the SRSS, notably until 2011, the Australian Red Cross really was the primary provider of the government's outsourced welfare services to asylum seekers. However, from 2012, other groups were able to tender and provide services, and there are now 8 organisations delivering the SRSS across Australia. None of the other organisations are international, some are not formally humanitarian, but I note that most of the NGOs involved also provide some other form of government-funded settlement and humanitarian services. All of these organisations won contracts via open competitive tender. This rather ugly slide gives you some sense of the not at all insignificant value of these contracts between the Department of Home Affairs and the service providers. And the variation in numbers reflects national providers as opposed to those based in some of the smaller states and territories. Most notably for the talk today and my purposes, these contracts include mandatory reporting provisions in relation to clients' breach of what is called the Asylum Seeker Code of Behaviour. The code, for those of you who may not have heard of it, was introduced with bipartisan support in 2013. Signing the code is a requirement for any so-called unauthorised maritime arrival to be released from immigration detention. What that means is refusing to sign the code leads to ongoing and indefinite detention while one's claim is being assessed. The code's terms are quite extraordinary. Asylum seekers who have signed the code are bound by a list of 6 expectations. These expectations include a reiteration of existing law, which of course applies anyway, but the code far exceeds existing law, criminal law otherwise, and requires asylum seekers, amongst other things, not to engage in activities that are disruptive or considered to be inconsiderate or disrespectful. This includes, in the code's explanatory terms, refraining from spreading rumours, spitting and swearing in public, or persistently irritating anyone. In other work, I've looked at the code as a kind of prime example of crimmigration regulation, so the intersection between criminal and administrative laws and the very real effect it has had on asylum seekers living in the community. I'm shifting the focus in this talk to looking at the role of the NGOs in administering it. But to give you some sense of the other terms, this slide shows you the code itself, the one that is signed, and you can have a look at it as I go on. Lastly, and importantly, the outcomes for breaching the code are severe. income support may be reduced or stopped, an existing bridging visa may be cancelled, and asylum seekers may be re-detained either in onshore detention or indeed transferred offshore. So the government, via the contracts outlined above, has outsourced core aspects of policing and enforcing the code to the SRSS NGOs. Two redacted contracts released by the department under FOI plainly reveal the NGO's mandatory reporting duties. The contracts state that the providers must make the department aware of any breaches of the code. They also set out that providers must assist asylum seekers to understand and comply with their obligations under the code. Although the code itself does not stipulate who may report a breach, it's significant to note that the department expects to receive allegations from, of course, service providers, police services, government agencies, and members of the public. So you get a sense of the code as a kind of permanent tool of surveillance in terms of who may report on the code. In 2018, the department surprisingly actually fulfilled a further FOI request made by myself and my colleague Dr. Elise Methman, who was my collaborator for this aspect of the work. And that request led to an unwieldy table of 499 alleged breaches of the code over approximately 2 years. So thinking about the digitisation of welfare, this table was very much at the other end of the digitisation process. So just to give you a bit of a feel for what that table looks like, I've got a little bit of an excerpt of it here. I appreciate that it's hard to read, but just to give you a sense of the data. One of the major and unanticipated findings from this data for us was that the NGO caseworkers were responsible for more than 2/3 of allegations under the code. So making them by far the predominant source of reports of asylum seekers breaching the code, leading again to those severe consequences for a breach of the code. Police, by comparison, accounted for about 5% of allegations. As such, the NGOs are absolutely central to the operation of the code as a tool of surveillance, discipline, and punishment for asylum seekers living in the community. And so there you can see the kind of breakdown of reporting and instant reporting, that second 7% alongside the SRSS provider is also the SRS provider involved here. Oh, I just saw my chat. Kate, feel free to holler if I don't see my final minute. Before moving to a couple of concluding comments, the other thing that I wanted to highlight and deal with is the NGOs, that the fact that the NGO's role in policing the code needs to be read alongside the fact that the NGOs are the asylum seekers' primary source of welfare, information and casework support. So they directly distribute the only form of financial welfare available to asylum seekers who arrive by boat. This is the case even though every encounter with these organisations is also a site of surveillance and possible reporting to the government of breaches either of the code or visa conditions more generally. In terms of demonstrating the NGO's exclusionary role, the SRSS as a program, I think, is best understood as a form of deterrence. It's aimed at making daily life so unendurable that asylum seekers live a life structured by destitution and ideally and possibly voluntarily repatriate or leave the jurisdiction. This is due to both the very limited eligibility criteria and the extremely meagre level of support for those who do qualify for the program. To give a very brief sense of that, the SRSS fortnightly payment is indexed to Australia's national unemployment payment, but falls short of it by 11%. I think this gap is directly and symbolically punitive, especially as the national base welfare payment has been repeatedly assessed as far below the poverty line in Australia. I haven't gone into it in the paper itself, but the restrictive terms of the program endured during the pandemic. There was no modification or reassessment of the ways in which asylum seekers had been at the core of the loss of work, and ultimately at the centre of exclusions around COVID-19 welfare payments. In the interest of time, I'll wrap up with Walter's observation that humanitarian participation is part of the regime of border control and separate from it, and that the contracted NGOs which both provide and deny welfare have become intrinsic to a policing network of the state. And I'm happy to talk more about the SRSS design and eligibility criteria in particular in discussion, and we'll hand back over to Kate.
Great, and we'll be transitioning to Jenna next.
Perfect. So unfortunately, I don't have beautiful slides like Anthea, but I'm really happy to be here. Hello, everyone. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to speak on this panel alongside such brilliant minds. And a special thanks to Lee, Julia, and May for their work in organizing the conversation series. I'm joining you all from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, where I would like to pay my respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the call today. My contribution today is a case of the transnational regulatory welfare state, that of Lebanon. Drawing upon my ethnographic research of the Lebanese digital welfare state, I'll discuss how regulatory transfer in the name of humanitarianism and development crises can hollow out the state. And along the way, I'll note how digital technologies and data protection frameworks actually contribute to this drainage of state control. I'll conclude by using Lebanon to highlight a couple areas of connection and disconnection in the regulatory welfare state literature more broadly. So since about 2019, the context in Lebanon has become absolutely dire. The World Bank describes it as possibly one of the top 3 most severe crisis episodes globally since the mid-19th century, and as, quote, one of the deepest depressions in modern history. Unprecedented levels of hyperinflation, a collapsing health sector, rising social tensions, and a revolving door of caretaker governments, just to name a few, have exacerbated shortages of most essential goods and services, such as fuel, water, and electricity. According to the UN, now 82% of the population lives in multidimensional poverty, with rates expected to be even higher amongst the refugee populations, which is the largest per capita in the world. So despite the vast need for social assistance and humanitarian aid, Lebanon is actually one of the only nations in the world in which the state does not provide minimum social services for its citizens. As a result, there's nothing but gaps in welfare provision. A plurality of non-state actors, including NGOs and INGOs, religious groups, community groups, and international governance institutions consequently fill the vacuum left by the state. These non-state welfare providers receive financial support from donations and larger grants that are pouring into the country, especially those from the EU, World Bank, IMF, and donor nations. However, the provision of these funding injections has been disrupted by the nation's political legitimacy crisis. There's long-standing distrust of the Lebanese government elite, given its track record of corruption, irresponsibility, and political stalemate. Calls to hold the Lebanese government accountable and to upgrade their regulatory oversight have thus continued to grow over time. And this has especially been the case since the Beirut port explosion of August 2020 that highlighted the quite literally deadly repercussions of the nation's political opacity and unchecked powers. So activities to regulate Lebanon's government institutions are well underway, largely occurring through welfare, humanitarian, and development interventions. A prime example is conditionality that's attached to international aid. As of mid-2020, Lebanese state bodies must meet a set of demands set by foreign state donors in order to unlock international aid money. This includes reforms to the government, structural economic reforms, security sector reforms, and instituting anti-corruption measures. We also see technology taking up a regulatory role, which is of course not unique to this space. Longer-term development interventions, like rebuilding the port, starkly emphasize the need to embed digitization. Reports explicitly advocate for RegTech, which is the use of technology that's often automated to regulate behaviors and compliance. In Lebanon, RegTech is being framed as a viable solution to the need for transparency and to support evidence-based policymaking, which is really interesting considering their electricity, which is required to operate these digitized interventions, is quite limited and continues to get worse as time goes on. Data collection in the country is also stifled with tons of problems, but I'm happy to discuss this in the discussion. So as Professor David Chandler at the University of Westminster argues, this pressure to regulate the state is driven by the needs of transnational governance actors for new forms of cooperation, but also for new ways of legitimating their international regulatory role. And I'll get back to some ideas about legitimation a bit later. So at the same time as technologies, norms, and engagement of regulation expands, the Lebanese state is simultaneously being hollowed out in terms of its decision-making power and participation in welfare governance. Welfare expenditure and design are basically entirely led by foreign states and international organizations like the World Bank, EU, and UN. And what's interesting to me is that technology plays an important role in this hollowing out. Digitized financial donation platforms for humanitarian assistance, referred to as fintech, completely circumvent government participation. They distribute capital directly to NGOs, community groups, and prominent international organizations out of fear that funds will not be used to support the populations in need. And of course, these concerns are not without merit. Lebanon's political parties do have a track record of siphoning off resources from the public sector and from development aid. But in this process, Lebanese public institutions are not meaningfully included in transnational consultations. They are prevented from direct access to aid, and they are excluded from the coordination of welfare relief. I interviewed INGOs, state representatives, and technology experts located all around the world. And what's really interesting is that across the board, they told me that they deliberately worked very minimally with the government. They would, however, partner with Lebanese-led organizations, and many expressed that that was very important to them, but local groups took more of a backseat and supportive role, being tasked mainly with on-the-ground provision. Government participation primarily manifested itself indirectly through UN agencies and also through performative visibility of government employees at intersector meetings. My participants often brought up their institutional codes of conduct and foundational humanitarian principles. These regulatory frameworks often supported the exclusion of the Lebanese government from welfare planning. For example, they could not guarantee do no harm and not leaving the communities worse off if the government participated because it could fuel social tension and corruption. Institutional data protection and security policies also bolstered government exclusion. For instance, the government requested access to various sources of data, like a list of refugee beneficiaries receiving aid from the Beirut port explosion. Sharing such data could risk welfare recipients' safety, violate the aforementioned codes, and could perhaps even breach formalized regulations like the GDPR. So of course, my participants denied such requests from state agencies. Overall, this context presents a set of contradictions. On the one hand, by manipulating incentives to shape state actor behavior, regulatory and disciplinary relations of power emphasize capacity building. And what I mean by this is that influencing a reform-minded government aims to eventually produce a functioning state, one that can reliably regulate the conduct of its own members and responsibly design and spend international aid. On the other hand, interventionists legitimate their rights to undermine state autonomy based on the presumption that the state is incapable of self-governing. So what we have here are both logics of state capacity and incapacity occurring at the same time. What we see is that a colonizing effect takes place through enactments of the transnational regulatory welfare state. As PhD student at the University of Sussex, Ali Qassem argues, this aid is disempowering. And in another sense, coordination centered around welfare programming saliently risks Lebanon, quote, falling into the same colonial traps that led the country into crisis in the first place. And indeed, this is a major risk considering France is leading many of these humanitarian and development discussions. However, it is France's colonial rule that actually created a lot of the political and welfare issues that they're responding to in the present without any recognition of this colonial legacy. So taken together, what does this case reveal about the regulatory welfare state? What's really interesting is that even in spaces of state collapse, state failure, or a weak or transitioning state, we can see the regulatory state functioning. And in fact, it is these conditions of collapse that manifest the regulatory welfare state in perhaps more coercive and globalized ways that this body of literature merit interrogating further. This not only raises important questions around sovereignty and autonomy in the regulatory welfare state, especially given the prominence of global North-South power relations in the dispersal of international aid. It also suggests that perhaps we should reconsider or challenge the use of the term state. There is a predominance of foreign intervention, non-state actors, and even non-human actors, and some would even argue that Lebanon is barely a state at this moment in time as is. As such, regulatory welfare in crisis contexts is often more globalized and transnationally enacted than state-bound. And of course, much of this actually flies in the face of calls to localize and decolonize humanitarian aid. On the ground, what we're seeing is a disconnect, and it's much, much different. Decision-making power is still disproportionately located away from local groups, while industrialized nations and former empires assert control. And finally, I want to briefly flag the emerging field of digital humanitarianism, which in a nutshell considers how basic service provision increasingly relies on smart technologies, information processing, and remote management practices that enshrine a technology-based ecosystem. So digital humanitarianism could point to a few avenues of the regulatory welfare state that are underexplored, and I think they would make really great conversations when put alongside each other. So for instance, by bringing together the two fields, we could discuss how regulating through and in technology shapes contemporary welfare. Much of the literature can also offer empirical insights on macro and micro levels. So for instance, it can shed light on processes of inequality for beneficiaries, like how crisis informatics and biometric data disproportionately track and exclude populations along lines of race, class, and nationality. And at the structural level, digital humanitarianism can offer insights on what it means for big tech to be increasingly involved in welfare despite its underregulation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jenna. That was wonderful. So my name is Walter. I'm a PhD student here at the ANU, although I'm speaking to you from the historic lands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. I'd like to thank Anna and Jenna for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful panel. And today I'll be speaking about a slightly different topic, which is public health, particularly in Western states and particularly with the digital trend that public health is starting to take. Now, admittedly, public health might not be the first thing that we think of when we talk of the regulatory state or the welfare state, but I think the COVID-19 pandemic has made it quite clear that it is a facet of both of these things. In funding and providing access to vaccines, public health provides a welfare-style service, and in setting rules around masks and lockdowns, it's also very much a regulatory system. And just like in the humanitarian sector, as Jenna was describing, public health has recently been experimenting with digital tools that might change the way that it provides these welfare and regulatory functions. And I'd just like to start with a short example. So last year, when Greece was starting to open its borders during the pandemic, it only had so many testing resources for COVID-19. But rather than randomly testing potential entrants to the country, officials turned to artificial intelligence. They asked for many people who wanted to enter the country to submit information about where they were coming from, their demographics, and other data, which was run through an algorithm to predict which types of people or groups of people might be most likely to be infected, even if asymptomatic. Those people had to be tested before they could enter the country. Others were simply admitted. Now, the system is being praised in some spaces because it may have reduced infections in Greece, which is certainly a good thing. However, this is also absolutely a case of a digital technology regulating migrants and regulating, changing the conditions under which people can cross a border. So this raises a number of questions, but I'd like to dig into just one today. And that is, how does this digitization of public health, or how might it change or shift the way that public health is practiced and experienced by real people? So before answering that question, I think we should take a step back and recognize that even before the digital era, public health has always required good information, good quality information, and reasonable amounts of it. Whether you seek to monitor a health issue, prepare for or respond to a public health problem, you need good data that can help understand how a health condition is moving through a population over space and time, how different groups might be experiencing that problem, and what their needs might be. That information can then be used to craft the best public health services and intervene in only the most invasive way, in the least invasive way that is needed, while still promoting the public health. However, recently, in the last maybe 6 or 7 years, there's a new concept that started to emerge called precision public health or digital public health. And the narrative behind precision in public health is that public health ought to be more efficient, effective, and targeted. And to do this, public health actors should collect more amounts and more types of data about a population and use that data to break out which particular groups and subgroups are experiencing which health problems in what places at what times. The idea being then that public health actors can craft interventions in real time that are targeted and efficient. Efficiency is often a key piece of these narratives. The way that you do this is typically by relying on digital technologies or tools. So collecting new types of data like electronic health records, collecting data through new routes, such as through smartphones, and using new analytic tools like artificial intelligence. And certainly some national public health agencies are interested in this, perhaps especially the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, but some global and transnational actors are starting to be interested as well. The World Health Organization seems increasingly interested in artificial intelligence and just released a report on it a few months ago. And the private group, the Gates Foundation, has now started to explicitly use the term precision public health in some of its functions. So certainly there is interest in this concept, and it might start to really take hold. Of course, precision public health could offer real benefits, driving positive health outcomes, but we'll need some empirical data to see whether this is so. However, I'd like to focus on some more problematic issues that might come out of digitizing public health in this way, particularly in ways that it might shift or change the practice and experience of public health. And I'd like to focus on 3 more theoretical issues. The first is that if you're not really careful, collecting public health data through digital tools and routes might end up rendering some populations invisible or less visible to public health actors. So early in the pandemic, a company in the US was marketing a smart thermometer that you could use to take your temperature and it would connect to your smartphone. And they were saying at the time, oh, perhaps we can create a data set that will show how fevers and thus COVID is moving through a population. Now, to my knowledge, no public health agency actually used such a data set, but imagine if they had. This sort of data set collected through this tool would almost certainly exclude or limit data from people experiencing homelessness, people in low-income households, and people with limited access to the internet. So if public health actors were to use a data set like this, there's a real concern that the data might not be representative and that it might point them towards providing services to away from those populations that do actually need help the most. Second and related concern is that of algorithmic bias. Now, we've already seen this in the healthcare setting. Just a few years ago, Obermeyer and colleagues published a big report in Science showing how a hospital system in the US had deployed an artificial intelligence program that systematically recommended that white patients receive more care than Black patients, even when they had similar symptoms. Now, it turns out this is because in the past, white patients indeed had received more care than Black patients, which is no doubt a product of racism. However, the algorithm took this biased data, internalized it, and then propagated those inequitable health outcomes through its recommendations to staff at the hospital. So certainly this is a concern at the level of a hospital, but it's also concerning if national and global public health actors are to start using artificial intelligence. There needs to be extreme caution and attention to the reality that biased data, that biased algorithms could give recommendations that may actually siphon resources away from the communities who need it the most and provide it towards communities who don't need it quite as much, but have access to public health services more in the past, or some other sort of bias in this vein. A third and final problem I'd like to discuss is how digital tools might change trust in public health agencies. So public health needs generally a baseline level of trust from the public to ensure that people are willing to provide accurate and complete information, which is needed in turn to design the best public health interventions. But as we shift towards using digital tools in public health, and digital contact tracing is an example from the COVID-19 pandemic, a number of actors have started to raise concerns about, well, is all of this data necessary? Who is collecting it? How is it being stored and used? And this is particularly troublesome for at least some because private actors and technology companies in particular are often involved in the development of those tools that end up underpinning precision public health services. And this is also happening against the backdrop of the public becoming or being willing to scrutinize the technology sector a little bit more. So if public health actors are going to use digital tools, they should be aware of these potential trust issues and really think through strategies for maintaining trust, maintaining legitimacy, and really using data appropriately. Now, complying with data protection law may be a potential help here. Although I should note that in the Greece example that I presented earlier, it would appear that Greek officials thought that this intervention was consistent with data protection law like the GDPR. Now, I'm certainly not a GDPR expert and I can't speak to that, but it's notable, or I think at least the signals to us that compliance with data protection laws might not be enough to cure some potential trust or perceived legitimacy issues as regulatory welfare state actors are starting to use digital technologies or continuing to use them. So just to conclude, these three issues that I've wanted to point to are the potential of digital tools in the regulatory welfare state to render some populations invisible, to propagate algorithmic bias through regulatory welfare services, and to create distrust or perceived legitimacy issues in these systems. And I've described them here in the context of public health, but I imagine, based on our other panelists' comments, that these are issues that are more broadly showing up. And so I look forward to discussing them. And thank you all for your time.
Thanks so much, Walter, and thank you, Kate and colleagues. I join you in your acknowledgement of country. I want to continue some of the themes of the conversation by telling the story of two regulatory welfare documents and thinking about what comparison does in helping us to illuminate what the state is doing and understand a little bit more about our own regulatory welfare state. So first of all, let me take you to Indonesia 15 years ago. One of the persistent social problems at that time was that there were large numbers of children who were born to unmarried mothers. And the effect of that was that the children couldn't access national identification. And that meant that they weren't eligible to be enrolled in school and they couldn't access healthcare. The Australian aid program at the time devised a way of intervening to address that problem. And that design involved enrolling the Islamic courts. The Islamic courts, or the Sharia courts, have jurisdiction over family matters that relate to Muslims in Indonesia, and that's a colonial legacy. The solution in this case was to create a kind of legal fiction. So the women who needed the documentation for their children would be granted a divorce and given custody of the children. And that would create the paper trail that would then allow the children to become registered. So it was a neat fix. It changed the lives of tens of thousands of children, and it was applauded as a really effective use of aid design with really significant social impact. In the story that we tell ourselves about that Australian aid intervention, we're also seeing the projection of Australia's regulatory welfare state abroad. And in this case, it's an emancipatory story, and it's also a story about one state's power to shape the governance of another state. But I want to suggest that there's also a covert comparative story there as well. As we listen to the story, we sometimes think silently, what a terrible situation. That could never happen here. But could it? How do we prove identity in Australia when the original documents have been lost or when they never existed? For an asylum seeker, for an Indigenous Australian in a remote location, or for a politician who has a parent who went through the disruption of a war-torn Europe? The answer is the Statutory Declaration. The Statutory Declaration was invented as a deregulatory fix back in the early 1800s that would allow people to assert the truthfulness of a state of affairs without having to swear an oath in front of a judicial official. And so instead, people were able to make a declaration in front of a justice of the peace who witnessed their declaration in a kind of solemn ritual. And that was particularly useful in the colonies of the British Empire, where Christianity wasn't the major religion. And we can see in handbooks for public servants from the mid-1800s, guidelines on how you administered a statutory declaration to someone who was blind or deaf or who didn't understand English. What's interesting is that in the intervening 200 years, the Statutory Declaration hasn't changed at all. So if you look at the Statutory Declaration form for New South Wales, one of the two available, it's still written in ye olde English. And all of the forms at Commonwealth level and across the states in Australia look as if they have been typed by someone in the 1950s. The Statutory Declaration is a kind of universal document to establish welfare entitlements in Australia. So regardless of whether you have original identity or documents or not, there are many times that you have to assert the truthfulness of the claim that you're making. And we use the Stat Dec as a universal form. And in order to do that, we have to find a witness, create the form in a paper format, sign it with a wet signature, have the witness also countersign it, and then submit it as a physical formal document. So the regulatory welfare state makes this process as onerous as possible. And baked into the process and the ritual is the assumption that the person making the statement is lying. And the ritual that's enacted in front of the witness is designed to remind the person making the statement that there are consequences, serious consequences, for making a false statement. We know at the same time that this kind of ritual is completely unnecessary, because when we file our tax each year, we're able to do that digitally, and we make the declaration that our tax return is truthful simply by checking a box. So what I want to suggest here is that as we look at comparative examples of how regulatory documents are designed and put into processes that constrain people, that comparison starts to reveal interesting facets of the regulatory welfare state. So we see ourselves in a mirror, and the mirror reveals the casual cruelty of the welfare state, the carelessness with which we treat people and their time and their entitlements. So the Statutory Declaration in Australia hasn't been reformed for 200 years, even though it's a foundational legal document, because we don't see it as affecting people's rights. We see it as simply part of the administrative machinery of the state. We haven't, for example, created a uniform definition of vulnerability in Australia, and that then makes it difficult to redesign these processes to account for different types of vulnerability and, of course, the intersectionality of vulnerabilities, even though we have ample research and plenty of Productivity Commission and Royal Commission reports that pinpoint exactly where those vulnerabilities are. The tale of the two documents also, I think, illustrates the important role of intermediaries. So the state in Indonesia could quite easily have fixed the identification problem for children, but instead it was happy to rely on the Islamic courts and the foreign aid donor to work out how to fix that problem in a way that didn't challenge the state monopoly on defining personhood. So the state jealously guards its ability to determine and direct what the marital status of a parent should be, in the same way that it controls the religious affiliation of its citizens. In Australia, we insist on intermediation for a stat dec. We insist on having a witness, even though the witness performs no service for the person creating the stat dec. What research shows fairly conclusively is that for vulnerable people, the need is really for explanation and support. And that explanation and support needs to come from a human being. A witness is not able to give legal advice about the Statutory Declaration, and we haven't provided any kind of support service around what is fundamentally a fairly difficult document and a fairly difficult process to understand. We preserve the fiction that the Statutory Declaration is absolutely required because it's the only thing standing between the regulatory welfare state and an army of dishonest claimants who would otherwise overwhelm the system. But of course, when we look at the empirical evidence of how statutory declarations are used and enforced, we find that at the Commonwealth level, prosecutions for false statutory declarations are running at about 3 a year. So either the state is correct and the statutory declaration has been completely effective in holding back all of these dishonest claimants, or those dishonest claimants never really existed at all. And what we see instead is high levels of compliance with a very, very onerous system. There is a hopeful chapter in this story. I'm currently working with the deregulatory task force at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to chart a reform pathway both for statutory declarations and for deeds. Although that works under the umbrella of modernising business documentation, I've been really impressed with the level of attention that my government colleagues have given to how reforms can address social inequity and, at the very least, not make it any worse. We don't know how the story ends. Doing regulatory reform in a federation is very complex, but I hope I've given you a sense of why it matters. And I want to close with a thought about a book by Frank Brennan from 1983. Frank has been a long-time friend of RegNet. And in 1983, he published Too Much Order with Too Little Law. And it was a reflection and a critique focusing on the Queensland laws that dealt with breach of the peace. and the many ways in which administrative mechanisms were used to stop people from legitimately protesting in a peaceful way. 40 years later, I'd say that looking at this kind of documentation reminds us that in Australia, we still have too much regulatory order and not enough justice. I'll turn back to you, Kate.
Great, thanks so much. That was fantastic. I think we've traced so many domains of the regulatory welfare of state from very, very localized and interpersonal through to the national and transnational and global. So that was absolutely fantastic. I knew you all could do it, but I have to say I'm impressed to see it. So we can take questions now. I have lots, but there's already some coming through in the chat. One is from Mary Ivick. I don't know, Mary, if you'd like to come online and share it. If not, I'm happy to read it. I'll pause just a bit to see. Oh, she's with us. Great. Mary, over to you when you're ready.
Hi. I don't know whether I can get my camera working. Can you hear me?
Yes, we absolutely can.
Oh, okay. Thanks. They were all so great. And I'm really conscious of time, and I sort of feel like I need to follow up with you all individually. But Anthea, I just wanted to say thank you for your presentation. And I've put my question in the chat, which now I cannot, oh yes, here it is, I can see it now. So I'm just wondering, just that first part of the question, which is to what extent do you think public attitudes, which are still quite negative towards asylum seekers, and general public is still quite supportive of offshore processing, quite supportive of boat turnbacks. So how do you, to what extent do you think that those attitudes support this relationship between government and NGOs that are doing this surveillance work?
Thanks so much, Mary. Thanks for the question. I mean, there are so many conflicting logics around the outsourcing of these welfare services, I think. So it's really hard to kind of trace it back to public attitudes or electoral politics, although I think they absolutely play a part. Because on one hand, I think the outsourcing does facilitate kind of further punishment and exclusion, because the accountability and transparency mechanisms that happen with the actual state, I know for all of their failings, are kind of much stronger and better than the accountability mechanisms that apply to the NGOs that then ultimately undertake this work. At the same time, and this is why I think empirical work is important, I don't think the NGOs are necessarily just getting behind the government's agenda. In fact, I don't think that at all. And I think the outsourcing is a diffusion of state power and opens up sites for kind of pretty significant resistance and solidarity with clients as work is being done. The way in which that happens and how it happens across organisations is a question that I can't answer. I do think the way in which the government quite performatively excludes asylum seekers who arrive by boat from state provision of welfare is absolutely connected to kind of a sense that is electorally popular and a mode of exclusion and punishment and essentially a hostility towards asylum seekers who arrive by boat. So I think there is a connection there. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily have, you can't kind of draw a straight line between the effects of that outsourcing and what that means for asylum seekers living in the community. But it's a great question. Just on the second part of the question that you've asked around whether or not teachers are involved, there's some really difficult and disturbing reporting about kids who are part of the SRSS program who are in Australian schools and public schools, and kind of minor truancy, so getting suspended from school or interactions with domestic Australian teachers that lead to punishment within the school system, are then reported via the distribution of welfare from these organisations back to the Department of Home Affairs and considered to be a breach of their responsibilities. So, and then of course, really active teachers resisting that happening in their schools and being very careful to protect asylum seeker students who are in Australian schools. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Anthea.
Yeah, Anthony, we have a follow-up in the chat. And so for those in the audience, again, please feel free to raise your hand, but also if you want your question to be public, you can put it in the Q&A. In the chat, only the panelists can see it, but I'll read this follow-up since it dovetails nicely with what you just said, Anthony. The question is, what advantages do caseworkers of NGOs and detention centers or of asylum seekers obtain from reporting breaches of code of behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. I mean, the question of advantage and disadvantage needs to be bracketed for a moment insofar as their contractual requirements, so their mandatory reporting duties, and so failing to report a potential breach of the code for one of the contracted organisations is a straightforward breach of contract. So there's an obvious kind of they're compelled to report breaches. That being said, Leanne Weber and Alison Gerard have also done work in this space, and they make the really important point that because it's a competitive tender process and because these organisations re-tender, any form of resistance to their contract or breaching contractual rules or contesting the department, of course, puts future funding at risk and really guides and governs behaviour, I think, in a way that there are different ways of structuring outsourcing or having public-private partnerships, but this is a way that I think structures very high levels of compliance with contract and reporting. So I think it's not so much a question of advantages, but really a requirement to do so and the risk of kind of funding organisations. And remembering too, I guess, that lower level employees also risk their jobs when they don't comply. So there are kind of levels of compliance within these NGOs where a caseworker may wish not to comply with some fairly unjust contractual terms, but they then risk their own livelihood and the terms of their own employment.
Right. I actually had a question for everyone. I was struck by how everyone really highlighted the plurality of the regulatory welfare state. Like there was no singular entity. Occasionally we would evoke the government, but even in Veronica's example, for example, she really pulled out the different actors who are operating there. And I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit more from everyone about what you think are the challenges studying this space in your field moving forward, given that you've all highlighted these really powerful non-human actors who might be enrolled in ways that reflect human biases, to use Walter's example, or assumptions about suspicion, to use Veronica's, or Jenna's seeking legitimacy and responsibility. I mean, you could go on, but I'm curious to hear, one, what you see the challenges are in your field of study in this space, but also two, what happens when we enroll these non-human actors in the role of governance in your space, and what additional challenges might that bring? And maybe we can start, maybe Jenna around, or whoever's got the first thought that comes to mind, so others can share.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a great question, and one that I continue to grapple with. So thank you for posing that, Kate. So in terms of challenges of studying this space, I recognize that my space is so incredibly specific. So methodologically, I'm facing lots of issues with COVID and with a deteriorating energy infrastructure in Lebanon. So remote interviews are something that I thought would be a way to adapt to the ongoing pandemic, but actually it's posing some interesting challenges. Also, in terms of studying this space, when you have so many actors involved, you're getting such diverse responses and oftentimes contradictory responses. And I don't think that's endemic of certain individuals and institutions being wrong, but I think something that we always need to recognize in this space, and I think something that all of the panelists did beautifully, was that there's so much complexity in these spaces, and there's such a multiplicity of effects and of perceptions of the consequences of the regulatory welfare state. And then in terms of that second part of the question of what happens when we enroll these non-human actors, I think at first it's a lot of chaos. So you need, and it's based off of a lot of assumptions. So there's an assumption that they will need technological literacy, that the platforms and code will be written in a singular language or be made in multiple languages. you need to spend tons of time and resources training all the different groups involved. And then when it comes to the non-human reporting platforms, at least in the Lebanese context, they're incredibly important, and all of my participants recognize openly the importance of reporting. And, you know, we don't want to work with someone who isn't reporting either, but the incredible burdens that reporting and regulation add to their already incredibly strained plates. So a lot of my participants noted that when you enroll these non-human actors, such as digitized reporting platforms, they would have to check in with all the different actors that they're partnering with. And there's issues because the partners will have to report on several different platforms simultaneously for the same job. They might be more familiar with one platform than another, and then other partners can't operate until the other partners are reporting. So then they're asking to report on their behalf. So they really emphasize that it's quite burdensome at times, but it's something that they're willing to work through, and something that a lot of humanitarian development systems are quite used to is trying to adapt to these challenges, because the crux of their work is operating in contexts of conflict and crisis and hazards.
Great, great. Yeah, the burden's certainly a theme that comes through, but you know, the non-human, as Veronica showed, is also not just digital, right? The document has agency too, but I'll turn it over to Veronica. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So one of the things that's being really energetically debated at the moment is what to do with that document. Can we digitise it? And digitisation is double-edged. So on the one hand, there's enormous commercial interest in digitisation because it takes the monopoly from the state and gives it to corporate entities that can commodify what were previously public documents. And the more you can develop these, the more you can claim a larger slice of the market and force government to pay you for that service. On the other hand, a really well-designed digital document can really increase access to information and understanding. You can make it in multiple languages. You can have call-outs that show people where to go for additional help. You can build in pauses to ensure that people actually understand what they're doing at each stage of the process. So theoretically, it sounds terrific. But the research also tends to show that vulnerable communities or communities with particular needs still need human intervention. And that doesn't mean paying a lawyer to help walk someone through a routine transaction. It means some kind of concierge service that buffers people from the efficiencies and the universality of the digital solution, which looks great for government but isn't experienced as particularly fair or open by diverse individual users. So it's really complicated, but Australia, like many other economies, is right at the point where we have to take some decisions about what this is going to look like for ordinary people.
Great, thanks. Walter, I might throw to you, and then Anthea, and then I know we have a question in the audience as well.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think I can only add to what Veronica and Jenna are already saying. In precision public health, you have a very complicated and maybe even confused space, because the public health and digital technologies, literatures and sectors and practitioners don't often communicate with each other, and now all of a sudden they are. And I think it's creating this sort of mixed space where there are these conflicting narratives. One's from public health about promoting the conditions needed to be healthy while not infringing on individual rights. But then you also have these narratives from technology that include efficiency and optimization and maybe even solutionism. And so precision public health is one of these weird spaces where those things are coming together and clashing, and there's a push for efficiency and optimization, and maybe we could even say a logic of financialization. Maybe that's not the right term. And that's conflicting with, that those narratives from technology are conflicting with the narratives and goals and principles from the space that the technology is coming into, public health. So I think that's one of the big issues that I see in trying to study this space. Certainly added onto that is the the fragmentation and complexity of public health happening at subnational level all the way up to the global and transnational level, and there are increasingly transnational actors. In digital public health, we're even seeing developers from North America and other high-income countries developing digital tools that then might be implemented in lower-income countries. And certainly there's often a gap in understanding of cultural sensitivity, among other things, that might create a tool that's just not useful or doesn't prioritize the needs of the people that will actually end up using this tool. So I think that also maybe speaks to the second question that you asked about enrolling non-human actors. And I think perhaps the comment that I would want to make is that non-human actors are still crafted and animated by humans and by assumptions and biases, and certainly that's the case for digital public health tools.
Yeah, great. I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about the imaginaries of how these get embedded in tools and how they take a life on their own and have different agency, but that's a really thought-provoking intervention. Anthony, I'll throw to you, and then we'll open it up again to questions.
I won't say too much about this to allow the conversation to keep going, but it did strike me in terms of thinking about the kind of non-human actors and questions of access are so real. And Veronica, just as the stat dec functions as this kind of magic tool amongst, I think, citizens or people who are deemed to be trustworthy or able to be granted the right of using a stat dec to declare the truth. I've done some other work around bogus documents and the use of bogus documents around refugees and asylum seekers for proof of identity, and just the fact that they absolutely are not given access to the Statutory Declaration, even though they are at the sharpest end of not being able to prove their identity by virtue of the very reason they're of their interaction with the state in the first place. And there's a really interesting body of case law developing around kind of the state claiming that the documents are bogus and then entering into these long-winded processes, expensive, long-winded, inaccessible processes to try and prove identity between states.
Yeah, great. Miranda Forsyth has a question. I might invite her to speak and ask it.
Thanks very much, everyone. And Veronica, when you were talking about the sort of, that need for that intermediary, I think of John's work with paralegals in Bangladesh. And I think that they were able to get so many people out of prison just simply through sort of providing that service of interpreting the documents and seeing, where were all of the legal problems. But my question was more, I suppose, to the panel, but maybe then if I had to choose one person, I'd direct it to Kate, to say, it seems to me that you're showing a trend towards a scary trend, really, towards a crueler state that doesn't, where there doesn't seem to be as many limits on the powers of the state. And thinking about the work of, I suppose, what you were showing, Anthea, that even those places where we would have thought restraints could be exercised, such as through NGOs, then they're also being sort of co-opted, I suppose, towards this greater disconnection between the state and the individual powerless citizen. And so, because I'm always wanting to see an optimistic story, where do you see a counter to that particular trend, if indeed there is a counter? It sounds like it's not in technology, not in civil society. Where is it? Thank you.
No, that's such a great question, Miranda. And I should say that theme probably comes out given that we wanted to pick cases that are not integral in the debates around the regulatory welfare state. And so in part because they are at the margins, we do see kind of the punitive end come in places. And I do think, based on research on technology can really enable that because it fixes things in ways that human discretion can push back against. And so that's just a caveat to say that, you're absolutely right. The cases we've highlighted do that. And I do think technology in particular can make the violent arm or the more punitive end of the arm of the state that much more concrete because it can remove agency. That's not to say there's not resistance and other kinds of actors mobilizing for change, but I think if we look at Veronica's example, she's highlighting ways that people are using where they have decision making and discretion to find ways of developing tools that can help people. I might open it up to others to share, but I guess one example from my own research, which we didn't talk about today, has been instances where actors who understand, for instance, a technological tool that's being deployed, they have found ways to insert themselves before the technology, to become an intermediary, to use Veronica's language again, to prevent that. So one of the examples was with welfare delivery. Because they go through a risk assessment and it raises a flag, at times, when there's still human actors involved, they can intervene. So people that are manager or frontline workers have found ways to jump into the algorithm where they're not actually supposed to be because they have an administrative privilege. So I think we have lots of examples of that, and we see lots of examples of civil society raising awareness of the harms. And I think we're actually finally having these discussions, and these are patterns that have happened, for a very long time. It's not just brand new because technology is in the space. So I actually do think there's a hopeful narrative that we're finally having these discussions and people thinking critically about how to intervene. But I'll open it up to others to weigh in.
I have one thought, and it's unusual to be the person researching border controls and the treatment of refugees to have much positive to say, but I think, again, as Jenna said, everything has kind of complicated effects and multiple effects, so it's hard to categorize. But it strikes me, and Walter, this probably connects more to your work, but the way in which I strongly contest COVID-19 as some kind of social leveler, but at least the shared experience of the hard interaction with the state that we've all had to go through around the state kind of regulating behaviour, enlisting ourselves into new state services, the complexity of that, and knowing that people are going through it at the same time as you has, I think, at least attuned the civil society and the general public to the challenges that raises in a way that really doesn't feel, or is at least not simultaneous or coincidental at other times where people kind of face that kind of hard state regulation. And certainly in the refugee and asylum seeker space, I think it is true that the pandemic has really brought to the fore a range of ways in which the state regulates populations because of the shared risk of the pandemic that has been absolutely kind of absent from Australian discourse and politics for so long. So, and that has created all kinds of legal challenges and sites of contestation, which I think, again, have led to mixed results, but have been really important.
Yeah, great response. I'm mindful of time, and because we're not in person, I know we can't have a spillover conversation, but I just wanted to highlight two questions that I've got. One from Depi about the role of public opinion media in shaping the transformation of the regulatory welfare state, particularly in Indonesia. So Veronica, I might throw that to you. And then we have a comment in the chat that raises the questions of AI and trust in public agencies and whether or not that's shifting things. And I think I can just briefly point that there's quite a bit of data about how Australians in particular are skeptical of AI taking over decision-making in government service provision. But there is some interesting research coming out that casts doubt on whether human oversight of that would actually deliver what people are expecting. So I think we might see a break from imaginaries of AI and what it can do versus actually what's happening on the ground. But Veronica, I'll throw it over to you for Depi's question around the media.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Depi. Great observation. In Indonesia, as elsewhere, the role of a free and diverse media is absolutely critical in intermediation. So the media is an intermediary in the way that it shapes discourse and distributes and underscores concepts about the regulatory welfare state, who is entitled, what they're entitled to, and what the obligation of the state is towards its citizens and its non-citizens. And that's one reason why our colleague Martin Krieger has been very, very focused on drawing attention to media and other intermediary actors as being important to constitute rule of law, to move our attention to that intermediation role rather than be focused on the rules, the regulations, and the architecture.
Great response, and thank you for keeping us right on time. So it is 2 o'clock, and I wouldn't be a good chair if I didn't highlight our next seminar and our third seminar, which is our last, which is on global connections and disconnections, markets, state, and earth. So we're going to be revisiting those big picture questions. We're not shying away from them to end off the series, and we do hope you all can join us at the same time from 12:30 to 2 next week. The link is in the chat if you'd like to sign up. It's right there, and I'm holding some time so you can click the link right now and sign up if you haven't already. But many thanks to everyone for joining us, and many, many thanks to the panels and organizers for enabling us to have this moment today. Really appreciated, and looking forward to more conversations moving forward. Thank you.